So I'll just start off by thanking the organizers for inviting me here and giving me the opportunity to present my work. I'm going to be talking about cognitive control in language production, and I'm going to do so both from the neurodevelopmental disorders perspective, but also from individual differences. So I've been working on language production and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder for about five or 6 years now. And we've really looked at a range of topics with this particular group. So we've looked at sentence production, both in terms of grammaticality and disfluencies produced. We've also looked over the lifespans. We've looked at children, adolescents, and adults who have this disorder. And so I have an example here from one of Rosemary Tannick's papers. And so, actually I'm going to stand back here so I can read this. So a child with ADHD says, "What are we going to do next, huh? What's in there? What's that?" And the experimenter replies, "You'll see in a sec." And the child interrupts, and the child says, "Where's the things? Where's the bugs?" And the experimenter says, "Pardon? What bugs? There are no bugs in here. Now tell me what." And the child responds, "The bugs. You said I'll see the bugs. I don't want to do this. I want to see the bugs, the the insects." And so I think you can see here it's difficult to work with these children, but also the thing that stands out to me is the number of disfluencies that are produced in this tiny little snippet. And so I should maybe say, just as a bit of background, that the prominent theories of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder assume that it is due to deficits in inhibitory control. And quite surprisingly, the symptoms of impulsivity and the symptoms of hyperactivity are, to a large extent, defined by inappropriate language output. So you have things like blurting out answers before questions have finished, frequently interrupting or intruding in conversations, making comments out of turn, talking excessively. So these are the characteristics of this particular disorder. So it's really a large extent defined by inappropriate language outputs. So in the first study that I want to tell you about, it was published in Memory and Cognition. And so in this study, we used a patient population to investigate a theoretical question in language production. So we took a clinical population, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is assumed to involve deficits in inhibition. And our research question is, does the production system rely on inhibitory control to minimize incorrect speech plans and disfluencies? And in general, disfluencies like pauses and corrections are assumed to be due to some kind of production difficulty. And so I'm going to start off by talking about three types of disfluency. Okay. So the first one's filled pauses, and so an example is, "That's a good question." And so the idea with filled pauses is that the speaker is going to experience a delay in what it is that they're going to say. And so they produce the filled pause to send a signal to the listener like, "Hang on a second, I'm going to experience a delay here." The second one is repetitions, and so an example of a repetition is something like near St. Isaac's Cathedral. So the idea here is that the speaker suspends articulation mid-utterance and then repeats something that they just said. And the idea with this type of disfluency is that the speaker is going to restore continuity to the constituent that was interrupted. And the last one is repairs. These are sometimes called false starts. And so an example here is turn left, right on Palace Embankment. So here you're getting the antonym. The speaker meant to say right, but they actually said left. And so these are cases where the speaker just simply produced the wrong word. And just as a bit of background, I'll just give the sort of traditional model of language production. So it's generally assumed to involve three main stages: conceptualization, formulation, and articulation. And this system generally has to take a non-linguistic thought and sequentially elaborate it lexically, syntactically, and phonologically in the course of speaking. And as the phonological plans are produced, they're stored in a buffer for a short time before they're passed on to the articulators. And the model is assumed to involve some kind of a monitoring system. So this model would assume that you use the language comprehension system to monitor your own speech plans before you say them, and if there's some problem with those speech plans, then an interruption has to occur and a correction. So just in this first study that I'm going to tell you about, our prediction is if this system relies on inhibition, then participants with ADHD should produce more disfluencies. And so we used a task that involved priming, and on each trial, participants saw 2 pictures and a verb, and their task was to produce a sentence. One of the pictures was animate, one picture was inanimate. So a participant might see a sequence like this, and this moved is an example of an ambiguous verb, and so if the participant sees this sequence, they're likely to produce a sentence like, the man moved the chair. If you get the reversed order where you see the inanimate picture first, you're going to be more likely to produce a passive sentence, right? So the idea is that the first picture that's presented is the one that's more activated. And so in this case, the participant should be more likely to produce a passive. The chair was moved by the man. We also looked at participle verbs. Participle verbs have a tendency to occur in passive. So in this case, if participants see the inanimate picture first, they should be more likely to produce a passive sentence like the bicycle was ridden by the girl. And if you get the reversed case, where you get the animate picture first, this is going to bias you to produce a past participle sentence, so something like the girl had ridden the bicycle. And what we found is that generally the participle verbs result in more errors because they have fewer syntactic options as compared to the ambiguous verbs. So this past participle there. And so in this study, we had nearly 200 participants. We've got typically developing controls, and we've got 2 different types of ADHD. So we've got one group that's ADHD primarily inattentive. So these individuals have elevated symptoms of inattention. We've also got the combined subtype. So the ADHD combined subtype has symptoms of both inattention and hyperactivity impulsivity. We also have 2 within subjects variables. We've got whether the animate or inanimate picture is presented first, and we've got 2 types of verbs. And so this study produced a corpus of about 7,000 sentences, and we ended up with nearly 700 disfluencies. And so let me orient you to this graph. We've got the different types of disfluency along the X, and on the Y we have the proportion of sentences with a disfluency. And what you can see from the number of filled pauses is that there's clearly no difference between the 3 groups. When we look at repetitions, you start to see this trend in which the ADHD participants are producing more than the control participants. And then finally, what we see with repairs is that repairs are much more common in overall. And then we get a group effect where the ADHD combined subtype is producing significantly more repairs than the controls and the primarily inattentive subtype. So when we look at this in terms of the within subjects conditions, we see this same pattern, and we actually get significant differences when the inanimate picture is presented first and the verb is ambiguous. So this is the condition that's biasing you to produce a passive when we know that actives are in general much more common. We also see significant differences in the case where the animate picture is presented first and the verb is a participle verb. And so this is the condition that's biasing you to produce a past participle sentence. We get a similar trend over here, although this one's not significant. So on the basis of these results, we concluded that preventing repair disfluency relies on inhibitory control, and it's in particular when the animacy and the verb biases conflict with one another. And we only get the effect with the combined subtype. We think that this actually makes sense because these individuals have elevated symptoms of hyperactivity and impulsivity, and that's the symptom domain that involves inappropriate language output. So these individuals have problems with motor control and behavioral outputs. And so this was really a study that got us thinking a lot more about what other individual differences, variables, might be important in language production, right? So things like executive function and intelligence. So the most common executive functions are inhibition, set shifting, and updating working memory. And these things are generally assumed to be low-level cognitive control variables that support many other higher level type processing. We also looked at intelligence, and here we just sort of assumed that intelligence represents the functioning of more broad-based neural networks as compared to executive functions. So executive functions are low-level control variables, functions, and intelligence is just essentially a broader measure of neural functioning overall. So what we did in this second study that I want to tell you about is we created a test battery that looked at 2 executive functions, and we also looked at intelligence. So we had 2 tasks to assess inhibition, the stop signal task and the Stroop task. We also had 2 tasks to look at set shifting. So here we have Wisconsin card sorting task, and we looked at the number of perseveration errors, and we also used the trail making task. Finally, we used 3 subtests from the Wechsler intelligence scale in order to assess intelligence. And if anybody has any questions about these specific tasks, you can ask me in the question section. These are pretty standard neuropsychological measures. So in this study, we had 106 community recruited volunteers, and it was the same task as the previous study. So see 2 pictures and a verb, and your task is to produce a sentence. And in this case, we actually looked at 4 different disfluency types. We looked at filled pauses and also silent pauses, or unfilled pauses, and repetitions and repairs. So to investigate this data, we used a latent variable approach. So I'm not sure if people are familiar with this, but these types of models have several advantages given the goal of the research question that we started out from. So the latent variable essentially extracts variance across several variables. So it helps you deal with task impurity issues. It also, when you build this type of a model, you can allow the latent variables to correlate with one another. These are the double-headed arrows. And then also the measurement error is kept separate from the latent variable. So what we did is we created this model, and we ensured that this model fit our data well. And then what we did was we added the disfluency variable. So we add the disfluency variable over here, and if we want to know whether or not disfluency production is related to any of these individual differences factors, we draw a line over to the disfluency, and we again want to ensure that this model fits the data well. And then what do? Is we go in, and if you set this pathway equal to 0, and you check to see whether or not the model fit significantly decreases. So conceptually what you do is you build a model that fits the data well, and you start breaking it systematically. And if you set one of these pathways equal to 0, and you get a significant reduction in model fit, then it suggests to you that there's unique and important variance along that pathway. And so following up from the finding on the previous study, with respect to repair disfluencies, we confirmed that result. So these are just typically developing individuals. And indeed, if you put repairs over here and you set the pathway from inhibition equal to 0, you get a significant decrease in model fit. So the factor loading from inhibition to repairs when it's not set to 0 is about 0.33. So that suggests that you can account for about 1/3 of the variance in people's tendency to produce repairs based on individual differences in inhibitory control. Okay. We also got a marginal effect with the unfilled or the silent pauses. So model fit marginally decreases when the pathway from intelligence to silent pauses is set equal to 0. So silent pauses are in some way related to verbal IQ. And so the results from this study led us to thinking about whether or not particular types of disfluency are linked to different problems within the production system, right? So if you have a repair disfluency where you say left when you meant to say right, you can sort of figure out, you can make inferences about what went wrong, right? the wrong lemma was selected, and it was articulated, it wasn't caught. But with unfilled pauses and repetitions, you don't have any evidence as to what the problem is. And so what we pursued in this final study here is, can we ascertain what's going wrong? And the most obvious thing that occurred to us was that possibly silent or unfilled pauses are related to memory retrieval, right? So I have to stop my speaking while my brain is retrieving some information, and then I can continue producing. So in this case, we actually modified the task demands to increase the memory load. And the hypothesis of the third study is essentially, if unfilled pauses reflect retrieval of upcoming information, then the number of pauses should be related to individual differences in memory ability. Okay? So for this study, we created a test battery that had several measures of working memory, and we also had several measures of IQ, because remember in the previous study, pauses were marginally related to IQ. And so in this study, we had 85 primarily undergraduate students, and the task was, it was sentence production, but essentially the participants had to memorize and then repeat a sentence back. And we used syntactically complex sentences like, while the woman dressed, the baby that was small and cute played on the bed. And because I'm running out of time, I'll just talk about the silent pauses, so with respect to the previous findings. But again, the procedure was the same. So we first created a model that fit the data well, and then we add pauses in here, and then we do the hierarchical tests. So when we do this, we put pauses over here, and the prediction was that potentially unfilled pauses are related to working memory if you have to pause in order to retrieve something from memory. However, we didn't find that. So again, similar to the previous study, we found that people's tendency to produce unfilled pauses is related to verbal IQ. So if you set this pathway equal to 0, model fit significantly decreases. Okay, so the general conclusions on the basis of all three studies are that repair disfluencies are linked to inhibitory control. We saw this first in terms of the ADHD combined subtype, but we also saw in terms of individual differences in typically developing controls or typically developing individuals. And at this point, we can't really make conclusions about whether or not this inhibition effect is related to any of the particular stages, right? It could be that it's a monitoring failure. In some cases, if it's the left versus right, the antonym, you could make an inference that it's due to lemma selection. But the monitoring system, we really just don't know that much about it at this point. Across two studies, two different tasks, we saw that silent pauses are linked to verbal IQ. And it's at this point that I get worried that somebody's going to raise their hand and say, well, what is verbal IQ? And I'm going to have to sheepishly say it's whatever verbal IQ tests measure. But I guess sort of just the general thing is that the brain's not keeping up with the mouth. So some type of a general processing speed issue. And so in future work, what we're really looking for is whether or not we can link the inhibition, the IQ, or the working memory results up to particular stages. So is it something that happens in the formulation stage, lemma selection, phrasal processing, or does it have to do with faulty monitoring? And I think that this work is going to be helped when we have a better handle on the neural mechanisms of production. So whether or not the anterior cingulate, which we know from behavioral errors that people produce. So if people make an incorrect button press, we know that there's error-related negativity. So you get a particular ERP component. If you make a wrong button press, we don't really know whether or not you get ACC or error-related negativity when you produce a disfluency in language. So that's another avenue for future work. These are my collaborators on all of these studies, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much.
Great talk. And I don't think I need it, but that's fine. Sure. Right, I hope you have plugs then, because my voice is sort of beaming. Right, great talk and good picture of Corley. I really liked it on the previous slide. So are you pushing a very egocentric, sort of very speaker-oriented idea for what motivates these pauses and disfluences? Because of course you don't have, do you deny any communicative function to them if it's all about inhibition and stuff?
Yeah, I would say speaker-centric for some of the disfluencies, repetitions, silent pauses. The one that I wouldn't necessarily make that claim about is the filled pauses, right? So Clark and Foxtree's idea is that speakers produce a collateral signal, so that producing an or an is essentially a signal, an overt signal to the listener to expect that they should be expecting a delay. And so in that case, a speaker's tendency to produce filled pauses might not necessarily be a bad thing. It might be actually a good thing. So yeah, it depends on the disfluency, I think.
So are you planning to do it in any Confederate design? Would that affect the program? If you do the same experiments in Confederate design, that should modulate your effect. If there is any communicative function to these disfluences.
Yeah, Corley's done that. One of Corley's students has done that study comparing monologue and dialogue, and they didn't get differences between those two.
Okay, thank you. Were your subjects English speaking? And would you expect any cross-linguistic variation in your results?
They were all English speakers, and I haven't really thought about what cross-linguistic differences I would expect. I know Andre's done some work in the production of Russian, where you have more flexibility, and he's found that in the cases where you have more flexibility, you have slower voice onset times, and so that's different from the English results. So in these, at least the two pictures of the verb past, we find that in cases where there's fewer syntactic options, people have a tendency to make more errors. So we haven't actually directly compared, but there is some suggested evidence that there's differences in terms of the number of syntactic choices that you have and whether or not speakers have difficulty.
Thanks. Could you go back to the slide with your model, the overview that has all these different tasks feeding into inhibition? That's where my question is. Yes. Oh, no, further. Yeah, this one. Okay. So there's a whole lot of different tasks in this list on the right. And in order to try and figure out in more detail whether the pauses are inhibitory in nature or whether they are reflecting speech planning, I was wondering whether you could say a little bit more about one of the tasks that I happen to know, which is the stop reaction time. I'm assuming this is the Logan method. And so my question then would be whether there is a parametric covariation between the interval that this task estimates as necessary in order to be able to inhibit a response and the duration of the pauses of the individuals. Sorry for the detailed question.
So you're exactly hitting on something that we've looked at, right? So not in this one, but in the other one with the working memory, right? You could potentially say that the length of the pause should correlate with individual differences in working memory, right? It's not the case. So there's no relationship. I didn't have time to present it, but there's no relationship between the working memory abilities and the length of the pauses. Okay, and then your other question is about the stop task. So I don't know if people are familiar with this task. It's essentially a go, no-go task. So if the participant sees a circle, they press one button. If they see a square, they press another button. And on 25% of the trials, there's a tone that sounds, and that means that you need to inhibit the button press. And so it's basically a variable procedure to find out how much time an individual requires to inhibit that button response. And I have never looked at stop signal reaction time and the length of pauses before, but it's an interesting possibility.
Hi, thanks for the talk. Can you go back to the example of the sentences that you used in the last experiment? So the really long one, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So would you think, I mean, how do you dissociate between the requirement of the memory versus the ability to produce complex grammatical structure? So this is while the woman dressed the baby that was small, the cute, played, blah, well, played on the bed. There is a lot of syntactic structure there, right? And as you said, it's related to what you said before, that if you have more syntactic options, that you expect the delay to be greater, right? So how much of that is the ability to retrieve that information from the working memory, from the actual ability to construct grammatical information?
Okay, good question. So in this case, it's just a memorize and repeat. So presumably they already have the syntactic structure because they're just repeating what they've read. So I think in this particular task where you're just memorizing and repeating, the syntactic processing demands aren't as high, whereas the memory demands, because you have to recall it from memory, are high. So it's a little bit of a difference between the task that has two pictures and a verb. So in that case, you do have to generate what the syntactic structure is, whereas this one you already have it.
So I guess the way to measure that would be to have sentences, long sentences, but without any syntactic dependencies, and see whether the working memory demand would be as explicit in those as...
Yeah. Potentially dissociate syntactic processing from working memory, yeah.
To follow up on the same question, this is a garden path sentence, so there should be some processing load involved in parsing it and reparsing it. And you didn't measure the delays, reaction times, only pauses, right? So do you think that they parse it correctly the first time?
When they're encoding it, we didn't measure. We didn't measure the eye movements as they were reading it. I do have reaction time as to how long they read it, but I'm not sure what that would tell you in terms of production then. But maybe I'm not quite understanding the question.
The production part is a pretty traditional paradigm of getting people to repeat verbatim what they had heard. And you can only do that if the first reading was there and all the interpretations were there. So you're not just talking about production here. If the sentence was not encoded, then that's how we catch second language learners. They don't encode the sentence properly. They cannot repeat it.
Okay. Now I think I understand the question more. Yeah. I mean, I guess I don't, sorry.
Short question. So are you planning to do this here at this
Imaging production is very difficult. I mean, yeah. So I haven't really thought about how one would go about doing that.
Do you think it's supposed to be a convergent task or do you both?
To basically have them silently, and then report it. Yeah, that's what you would have to do, I think, because you couldn't have people speaking and trying to record ERPs.
Well, what you need is a map.
Yeah.
You can do this source things.
Yeah.
Thanks so much again, Paul.